Hi everyone, my name is Maxim Namak, and today I'll be presenting my XC paper, When APIs Are Intentionally Bypassed, an Exploratory of API Workarounds. This was done in collaboration with my supervisor, Wei Sheng. So first of all, we believe that the knowledge gap exists between API developers and API users. So API developers make the API, API users use the API, but they actually communicate through communication channels that are outside of the API. Especially API developers usually communicate indirectly with their users using things like automated documentation, which is made using tools, or wikis, manuals, code examples, which are indirectly giving the information to users, usually for scalability reasons. But this also means that users don't necessarily have a direct communication line with developers, and therefore may not be able to get all of the information needed to properly use an API. But it also means that API users may not be able to give the feedback to developers that are needed to improve this API. So we want to manually observe communications between API developers and API users to see what that communication looks like. So we found that when API users ask questions like, that API works in there, but not in here, or I did that, but it doesn't work, or that API used to work, but it doesn't anymore, or there's a bug in that API, these questions often end with, is there a workaround? I actually do want this to work. So if a workaround exists, why are they requested? When are they used? And how can API developers integrate them into the API to improve the API and stop users from requesting these workarounds? So we systematically observed Stack Overflow posts to answer these questions. And we started with a Stack Overflow data dump of millions of posts, and we found over 250,000 posts containing keywords like API, library, framework, interface. That's a lot. So how do we filter these API user requests to look only for posts that concern workarounds? So we first start by pre-processing. So we remove any code, punctuation, stop words from the Stack Overflow posts. We keep only the posts with the keywords I mentioned before, and we then filter with trigrams. The trigrams are mentioned in the paper, but here's one I've found workaround. We use trigrams because they're simple to understand and they're easy to replicate if someone wants to replicate our study. So we're left with 1,846 posts using these pre-processing criteria. And we picked the top 400 Stack Overflow posts by score. We use score as a proxy for popularity. And then both authors read and label the posts based on categories that they come up with. Then the authors, including me, met, and we determined which categories could be merged and fit together. And then when we agreed on all the posts and all the categories, we recorded this and we resolved any disagreements. And these are the categories we came up with. So why did the developers ask for API workarounds? So in most cases, API users ask for runtime problems with the API. They're requesting workarounds for that. So if we look at subcategories of runtime problems, first of all, most of them are unexpected behavior. So things like scenario 2 no longer works, whereas other scenarios still work without problems. Or backwards incompatibility. This works great in version 3, but it doesn't work anymore in version 4. And this ends with, is there a workaround? The second most popular category is missing desired functionalities. So either there's a missing feature, is there an equivalent to get line number for streams in Java 8, or there's missing data from the API. So in the .NET framework, we can use that property, but that property doesn't exist in the current versions of the .NET Core. Is there a workaround? Can I get this information? Or sometimes there's a missing interface. Users believe that an interface should exist, but it doesn't. There's also cases where API users request improvements for the API. So for example, performance improvements, or they ask for help with API dependencies. So maybe they have some specific dependency they want to work with an API and it's not supported. And of course, in some cases, some of the posts don't have anything to do with what we were looking at, so they're not actually workaround requests. So how are API workaround requests answered? Well, the majority of them, so over half, are not currently supported by the API, and I'll subdivide that list in a few seconds. Some, a quarter, are already supported by the API, so the users are simply told, this is supported, change your way of thinking a little bit, and you'll be able to get this to work. In 13 cases, the user was simply confused. That's what they were told by the Stack Overflow community, and that ended that. And in 73 cases, there was either no answer or they were simply unrelated. So if we look at the majority of cases, most of them, the users are told, you'll need to implement a workaround, and they're given that workaround. And then in 80 cases, they're told, use another API. The one you're using will not do the trick. In 38 cases, they're told, this is not supported. There's no solution. You have to change what you want to do. In 32 cases, they're told, just wait. Eventually, a patch will come along where this is expected to be fixed. And in 3 cases, they're told, this is not recommended. Do not do this. So how can we use this information to actually help API developers? So if API users request workarounds, maybe we can identify useful workarounds for developers to help them improve their API. So we identified 3 patterns based on a Stack Overflow post and manual observation. We call these functionality extensions. So when users request extra functionality, deep copy when they actually want to access information from the API and use it in a completely different way on their own, and when they want multiple versions to be targeted. So we used these 5 APIs, so Guava, Hibernate, JUnit, Jackson, and Log4j, to look for instances in open source projects that use these APIs. So instances of the 3 patterns I mentioned before. So we searched by comparing class instantiations and method invocations versus overrides and extensions. So if there's a lot more overrides and extensions, then it makes sense that there would be something weird going on there. So we look at those. For deep copy, we look at the number of API field invocations and getter invocations. So if those are very numerous, something fishy is going on. And for multi-version, we look to see if there's multiple links for multiple jar files. So if a project is using multiple versions of the API, something fishy is going on. So we found 9 functionality extensions, 2 deep copy, and 1 multi-version API workarounds in the projects that we looked at. We reported these as potential improvements to the various API developers and got really good feedback for those. So if you want more information, please look at the paper. So today I presented my paper about the knowledge gap exists. I presented a 2-part study. I answered why developers ask for API workarounds, and I showed that we identified 3 patterns and what those patterns are. Thank you for listening.